On the morning of August 18, 2025, diplomatic circles across the world were shaken by unexpected news from Ouagadougou. The government of Burkina Faso announced that Carol Flores Morexio, the United Nations' most senior representative in the country, was no longer welcome. She was declared persona non grata and ordered to leave immediately. For many, it was not just a bureaucratic expulsion, it was a political earthquake. The decision came only days after the release of a United Nations report that sent shockwaves across Africa. Covering 2 years of conflict, from July 2022 to June 2024, the report accused all sides in Burkina Faso's war of abusing children. The numbers were stark and painful. 2,483 grave violations against more than 2,000 children, including recruitment as child soldiers, sexual violence, and attacks on schools and hospitals. The accusations reached the global media within hours and placed the transitional government in the harshest light yet. But President Ibrahim Traoré did not respond with long press statements or cautious negotiations. He acted swiftly and decisively. His government argued that the report had been published without consultation, without a right to reply, and without legal evidence. To them, this was not transparency, but sabotage. It was an attack, not only on the state, but on the dignity of a people fighting to rebuild in the middle of war. Supporters of Traoré framed the move as a defense of sovereignty. Critics saw it as censorship and an attempt to escape accountability. Yet beyond the headlines, a deeper question began to emerge. Was this the move of a leader silencing scrutiny, or of a nation refusing to be defined by outside judgment? The answer, as the world would soon discover, was not simple. The expulsion of Carol Flores Morexio was not a minor administrative move. It became a storm that swept across the country and reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Ouagadougou, the announcement was broadcast live on state television. Within hours, the streets began to fill. People gathered in Revolution Square not with chaos, but with determination. Supporters carried flags, painted their faces with national colors, and held signs declaring that their dignity was not for sale. The mood was not one of frenzy, but of steady defiance, a people signaling that they would not be spoken for by outsiders. Youth groups were the first to seize the moment. Pan-African activists quickly turned the decision into a digital campaign. Hashtags such as African sovereignty and Our Voice, Our Right trended across platforms from TikTok to Telegram. Videos of President Traoré's speech spread rapidly, shared not only in Burkina Faso, but in neighboring Mali, Niger, and Ghana. In Accra, radio callers debated whether their own country should follow a similar path. In Niamey, murals appeared overnight depicting Traoré as a modern-day Sankara, raising his fist in defiance of global institutions. For many young Africans, the expulsion represented a generational stand, a refusal to accept narratives imposed from abroad. But within Burkina Faso, not everyone applauded. Civil society organizations raised concerns almost immediately. Leaders of humanitarian groups worried that the expulsion could jeopardize critical aid programs. Clinics dependent on UNICEF vaccines and schools supported by international agencies feared interruptions. Opposition politicians accused Traoré of prioritizing pride over pragmatism. They warned that national dignity could not replace food shipments, infrastructure support, or refugee services. Local journalists asked pointed questions. If the UN's report was flawed, Why had the government not presented an independent investigation to prove its case? Critics saw the decision as a retreat from transparency, cloaked in the language of sovereignty. International reactions came quickly. In Washington, the State Department called the expulsion deeply troubling and urged Burkina Faso to reconsider. Officials described it as a dangerous precedent that might embolden other states to reject oversight. At the Pentagon, some feared the move signaled a deeper alignment with Russia, Turkey, and China, countries eager to expand their foothold in Africa. European leaders were equally unsettled. Brussels suspended discussions on a climate resilience and food security package that had been months in the making. France, already reeling from its diminishing influence in the Sahel, interpreted the expulsion as yet another blow to its role in West Africa. Analysts in Paris described it as part of a geopolitical divorce that was no longer symbolic, but structural. On the other hand, Moscow and Beijing celebrated. Russian state media praised Traoré's boldness, framing him as a leader who refused to bend to Western pressure. Chinese diplomats offered new partnerships in agriculture and technology, promising collaboration without conditions. Ankara also moved quickly. Turkish officials declared support for Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty and pledged to expand bilateral humanitarian assistance. In these capitals, the decision was not viewed as reckless, but as an opening. It was a chance to rewrite alliances and deepen ties where Western influence was fading. The African Union walked carefully. Within 48 hours, an emergency session was convened. Its public statement urged dialogue and respect for diplomatic norms, but avoided direct criticism of Burkina Faso. Behind closed doors, many African diplomats admitted they sympathized with Traoré's frustration. They too had felt what they described as narrative asymmetry, reports from international institutions that emphasized failures while ignoring progress. Some ministers whispered that the UN had underestimated how deeply issues of dignity and representation resonate in African societies. Others, however, worried about precedent. If every government responded to criticism by shutting doors, could regional cooperation itself be undermined? Among African citizens, the story resonated with unusual force. Social media overflowed with debates, songs, and commentary. In Nairobi, student groups organized forums asking whether international institutions had ever truly represented African voices. In Johannesburg, scholars on talk shows connected the expulsion to a longer history of post-colonial struggles. Across the continent, the event was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was becoming a symbol of Africa's broader confrontation with institutions that had often spoken about the continent without listening to it. Yet in Burkina Faso itself, the consequences were immediate and tangible. Aid offices hesitated to proceed with ongoing projects. Communities that relied on outside assistance began to feel uncertainty. The government insisted that sovereignty would not mean suffering, but ordinary families wondered how long assurances could replace supplies. And so, as the dust settled, one truth became clear. The decision to expel the UN's top official was not only about a report or a single diplomat. It had transformed into a defining test of sovereignty. The world was now watching closely, uncertain whether Burkina Faso had just opened the door to a new chapter of African self-determination, or set itself on a path toward deeper isolation. The expulsion of the United Nations' most senior official in Burkina Faso was not only a diplomatic act. It carried immediate consequences for people far removed from conference halls or press statements. In the northern provinces, where entire villages have been displaced by years of conflict, the news spread quickly. Mothers standing in line at small health posts asked quietly if the vaccines promised by UNICEF would still arrive. School directors in Kaya wondered whether the security training for teachers, scheduled for the following month, would be cancelled. In Wahia, a women's center suspended its trauma counseling sessions because the technical support it depended on came directly from the very UN office that had just been disrupted. What began as a political move at the national level soon translated into daily uncertainty for families already living on the edge. The government insisted that nothing essential would stop. Officials promised that aid deliveries would continue, but only under new conditions that respected national sovereignty. They emphasized that international partners were welcome if they cooperated on Burkina Faso's terms. Yet for many communities, the assurances felt distant. Local non-governmental groups were caught in a painful dilemma. Some feared they might be labeled as foreign agents if they echoed the UN's concerns. Others feared losing critical supplies if they stepped too far away from the state's new direction. In villages where shortages were already common, people whispered anxiously about whether food, medicine, and shelter would continue to arrive on time. Politically, the decision strengthened President Ibrahim Traoré's position. State media portrayed him as a leader who stood firm in defense of dignity, and the narrative resonated across the country. Within days of the expulsion, a poll by the Ouagadougou Institute of Public Opinion reported that his approval rating had risen to more than 80%, and among young people, it climbed even higher. The National Assembly responded swiftly by passing a new sovereignty bill. The legislation limited the reach of foreign surveillance activities, granted greater authority to domestic intelligence services, and allocated more resources for training young analysts and engineers. Ministers close to Traoré hailed the bill as a milestone, a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer accept outside interference in its internal affairs. But behind the triumph, there was unease. Opposition figures and civil society leaders questioned the long-term wisdom of the move. Independent newspapers, though fewer in number than in past years, pointed out that rejecting a UN report without offering an alternative investigation risked undermining the country's credibility. They asked why the government had not commissioned its own inquiry to confront the allegations directly. They warned that sovereignty is not simply a shield against criticism. It is also a responsibility that must be backed by evidence and transparency. In society at large, the atmosphere began to change. Universities organized debates on whether true sovereignty meant independence or isolation. Sermons in both churches and mosques invoked the language of dignity and resilience, linking spiritual endurance with political independence. Musicians released songs that celebrated the expulsion as a stand against domination, while painters filled city walls with murals of Traoré raising his fist against global institutions. These cultural expressions gave ordinary citizens a sense of pride, but they also revealed how quickly the expulsion was becoming a defining symbol of national identity. The economic effects soon became visible as well. Panic buying after the announcement drove fuel prices upward, forcing the government to impose emergency price caps. Grain imports from Ghana and Togo were redirected to stabilize supplies, and for the moment, markets kept running. Yet people remembered how fragile supply lines could be, and they worried that aid reductions or sanctions might worsen their daily struggle. In rural areas, the question was not abstract. It was whether a harvest would be enough without the seeds or fertilizer, often provided by international programs. Inside government circles, Traoré's closest allies celebrated the expulsion as a masterstroke of political strength. They saw it as a clear declaration that Burkina Faso was no longer willing to submit to judgments imposed from abroad. But more cautious advisors warned of potential risks. They feared that closing the door on one of the most powerful international institutions could lead to isolation that would be difficult to reverse. They wondered if other partners might follow the UN's example and reduce their presence, leaving the country without support in critical areas such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. And so the debate deepened. Was this act of defiance the foundation of a new independence, or a dangerous gamble that placed already vulnerable citizens at greater risk? In homes, markets, and village squares, ordinary people began asking whether national pride could fill empty classrooms, keep vaccines refrigerated, or bring food to refugee camps. The expulsion may have reinforced the image of sovereignty at the highest levels of politics, but its true measure would be found in whether families could live with greater security and dignity. The world watched, and so did the citizens of Burkina Faso, waiting to see if their leader's bold decision would deliver stability or leave them to face new struggles on their own. The shockwaves of Burkina Faso's decision reached far beyond its borders. In Washington, the State Department expressed deep concern and urged the government to reverse course. Officials described the expulsion as a dangerous precedent, warning that it signaled a broader drift of the Sahel away from Western partnerships. Intelligence briefings suggested that Burkina Faso was drawing closer to Russia, Turkey, and China, three nations eager to expand their influence in Africa. Behind closed doors, diplomats debated whether Traoré's move was simply a domestic political maneuver or the beginning of a new geopolitical alignment. In Brussels, European Union leaders voiced frustration. A new engagement package focused on climate resilience and food security was quietly placed on hold. Germany and Italy urged restraint, while France, still nursing wounds from its declining role in the region, described the decision as part of a larger political divorce between West Africa and its former colonial powers. European analysts admitted that the move exposed just how little leverage the West now held in parts of the Sahel. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing seized the opportunity. Russian media praised Ibrahim Traoré as a bold leader who refused to bow to Western pressure. Chinese diplomats offered technical assistance and investment, promising partnership without conditions. In Ankara, Turkish officials publicly supported Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty and pledged expanded humanitarian programs. For these powers, the crisis was not only a chance to win new allies, but also a chance to challenge the old order of global governance. The African Union walked a careful line. Its statement urged dialogue and respect for diplomatic norms, but stopped short of condemning Burkina Faso. Privately, some African diplomats sympathized with Traoré's frustration, pointing to what they called narrative asymmetry in international reporting. Others worried that the expulsion could set a precedent that might unravel fragile cooperation across the continent. Across the global South, editorials reflected on a familiar pattern. Powerful institutions often spoke for developing nations rather than with them. In this context, Burkina Faso's defiance resonated as part of a larger struggle for dignity and recognition. And so, the world faced a difficult question. Was Burkina Faso's decision a reckless rejection of accountability, or the first signal of a shifting world order where Africa no longer waits for permission to define its own truth? In the weeks that followed, the debate in Washington grew louder. The Pentagon defended the importance of United Nations oversight, while the State Department admitted privately that Burkina Faso's defiance had exposed deep fractures in the Western approach to Africa. Senators warned that ignoring the sovereignty concerns of African nations could erode trust far beyond the Sahel. One committee member went so far as to say that the crisis revealed a moral dilemma as much as a strategic one. The West demanded accountability abroad, yet often failed to offer the same transparency at home. In Europe, the reaction remained divided. France, still wounded by its declining role in West Africa, framed the expulsion as yet another rejection of its historical presence. Germany and Italy urged diplomacy, but feared that aid channels would dry up. Brussels quietly froze development funds, leaving uncertainty about whether promised projects would ever be delivered. For ordinary Europeans watching the news, the question was difficult to ignore. Was Africa slipping away not through violence, but through the steady erosion of influence? Elsewhere, the response looked very different. Russia continued to celebrate Ibrahim Traoré as an icon of resistance, filling television screens with his speeches and praising his refusal to bow to foreign institutions. Chinese newspapers portrayed the crisis as proof that a new multipolar world was emerging, where developing nations could no longer be dictated to by old powers. In Ankara, officials promised to step into the space left behind, offering medical supplies and infrastructure partnerships. Even in Latin America and Southeast Asia, editorials drew parallels to their own histories of being spoken for rather than spoken with. The African Union, caught between principle and pragmatism, issued carefully worded statements but avoided escalation. Some leaders sympathized, seeing their own struggles reflected in Burkina Faso's frustration. Others worried that if every nation pushed back so sharply, fragile continental cooperation could collapse. And through it all, one question echoed in policy rooms from Geneva to New York. If one small nation can defy the weight of the United Nations, what happens when others decide to follow? The decision to expel the United Nations' most senior representative in Burkina Faso was more than a diplomatic rupture. It was a declaration that the nation would no longer accept being judged only by outside voices. Yet the consequences were immediate and heavy. Aid offices slowed their operations. Civil society groups paused their programs, and families in rural areas began to wonder if food rations and medicines would continue to arrive. Sovereignty had been affirmed, but responsibility remained, and the burden of that responsibility would fall not on diplomats in New York, but on mothers, teachers, and children in Ouagadougou and beyond. At the same time, something undeniable had shifted. Across Africa, citizens and leaders alike began asking harder questions about who has the right to define justice. In Mali, Niger, and Ghana, the decision was hailed as courage. In Europe and the United States, it was seen as reckless. For Russia, China, and Turkey, it was an opening. And for many in the global South, it was a reminder that international institutions have too often spoken for nations rather than with them. The choice facing Burkina Faso now is not simply about whether the United Nations returns. It is about whether sovereignty can be more than a symbol. Can it deliver protection, stability, and dignity to the people who need it most? Can a young leader's bold defiance become the foundation of lasting independence, or will it become a story of isolation that leaves the vulnerable without support? If this story moves you, let your thoughts join the conversation. Sovereignty is not only a principle written in law. It is a promise to children, to families, and to the future. The world may forget the details of a report, but it will remember the rejection, And the true test will not be found in headlines, but in the lives of those who endure. So we end not with certainty, but with a question. Will this be remembered as the dawn of an Africa rising on its own terms, or the beginning of a retreat behind closed doors?